And so within the context of the Guardian Council approving Pezeshkian to run was widespread public discontent and historically low turnout in all the recent elections.
Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast for the foreign policy and global development communities and anyone who wants a deeper understanding of what is driving events in the world today. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg. I am a veteran international affairs journalist and the editor of UN Dispatch. Enjoy the show. On May 19th, a helicopter crash in Iran killed President Ebrahim Raisi and several top government officials. This forced new presidential elections, and on July 5th, Masoud Pezeshkian defeated his more hardline opponent and is now Iran's president-elect. Pezeshkian comes from the reformist faction of Iranian politics, but real power still lies in the hands of unelected clerics. None more than Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei. Still, this election will have an impact on Iran's relationship to the outside world, including the West. And joining me to explain the international implications of Masoud Pezeshkian's election is Sina Toossi, a senior non-resident fellow at the Center for International Policy. We discuss what we mean by reformist in the context of Iranian politics. That leads into a broad conversation about the kind of changes we might see in Iranian domestic and foreign policy as Pezeshkian takes the reins of government from a hardline faction that had been dominant for the last several years. Sina Toossi brings a really nuanced and valuable perspective to this question of the future of Iran's foreign relations. I learned a lot from this conversation. I know you will as well. And as always, please get in touch with me using the contact button on globaldispatches.org. While you're there, you can sign up for our newsletter and also unlock our new weekly podcast about the United Nations, To Save Us from Hell. Your support makes a meaningful difference. Please do consider becoming a paid supporter of Global Dispatches, which unlocks not only all of our archive content on Global Dispatches, but full episodes of our new podcast about the UN, To Save Us from Hell. Now, here is my conversation with Sina Toossi of the Center for International Policy. So just to kick off, Sina, can I just have you give a biographical sketch of who is Masoud Pezeshkian?
Yes, so Masoud Pezeshkian comes out of the body politic of Iran's government, the Islamic Republic. Within this government, he comes from the more reformist side of the spectrum, and his background is in the parliament. He was a 5-term parliamentarian representing a constituency in northwestern Iran in the city of Tabriz, which is a predominantly Azeri and Kurdish region with those two ethnic minorities there. His dad was of Azerbaijani heritage and his mom is Kurdish. So he grew up speaking Kurdish and Azeri. And interestingly, in his campaigning, he spoke both of these languages in his campaigns as well. And he actually got a very high disproportionate amount of the votes in these regions that put him over the top. Pezeshkian was also in the government of the reformist Mohammad Khatami in the early 2000s. He was the health minister then. And he's a cardiac surgeon. He comes from a medical background. And during the Iran-Iraq war, he's also a veteran of that conflict in the 1980s, in which he was a medic.
So he won these elections, which I suppose could not be considered free or fair. Can you just explain the mechanics of elections in Iran before we get into the actual results?
So Iranian elections are not free or fair. They're very constrained to within the official paradigm and confines of this Islamic republic polity, which is a theocratic system. It came into creation after the 1979 Iranian Revolution, and it's kind of a blend of certain republican elements and theocratic elements. And this has been like the perennial conflict within the politics of the Islamic Republic, is these more elected institutions and then these more kind of unelected theocratic institutions and other bodies such as the Revolutionary Guards, and vying for control and power. And so Pezeshkian, he made it through the filter of the Guardian Council to be able to run. Now, the Guardian Council is a 12-member body consisting of 6 jurists and 6 clerics, and they vet the candidates who seek political office. And it's very kind of somewhat arbitrary. There aren't necessarily clear criteria, and it kind of ebbs and flows with, it seems like, the policies of this kind of more Iranian deep state, the supreme leader, the balance of power domestically from between various factions. So we've seen in the past, since 2021, really, the more moderate and reformist factions of this government were heavily marginalized and sidelined and barred from seeking office, including in the 2021 election that brought to power Ebrahim Raisi, the conservative former president who died in the helicopter crash. And then we saw in subsequent elections for the parliament and for other bodies that reformists and moderates weren't even allowed to run, like the more prominent ones.
Well, so what does it suggest to you then that this Guardian Council permitted Pezeshkian to run in the first place?
Yeah, it's very interesting. So this election came in the context of 3 years of kind of uniform hardliner dominance over Iran's centers of power, various institutions, and President Raisi's track record ultimately didn't really deliver for the Iranian people. The economic situation continued to be poor. He failed to reach any kind of major diplomatic agreements with the US and West that could lift some of these sanctions that Iran has been under that have been heavily impacting its economy. And we've seen these major protests in recent years, especially the Women Life Freedom movement in 2022, which was the nationwide uprising that the government brutally repressed. And so within the context of the Guardian Council approving Pezeshkian to run was widespread public discontent and historically low turnout in all the recent elections. So, there's speculation as to why they allowed a more prominent reformist to run. The one I find most convincing is that the overarching goal was to increase turnout. But with that said, I don't think they expected Pezeshkian to win. I think they approved 5 other candidates who were all conservatives. And the popular perception in Iran was that one of these conservatives was really the preferred choice for the kind of Iranian supreme leader. But we saw that this election, it went to 2 rounds. The first round had a historically low turnout of 40%. And usually low turnout in Iranian elections has benefited the hardline or more conservative candidates because that's really the regime's base that comes out to vote consistently. But this time we saw that despite a very low turnout, Pezeshkian was the front runner after the runoff in the first round, and he won the second round by a pretty decisive margin against the more hardline candidate.
So what does it mean to be a reformist candidate in the context of Iranian politics? And, what reforms or policies might Pezeshkian be expected to pursue?
Yes, so reformism within Iran is also on a spectrum, and it really dates back to the 1980s and certain seminal divisions after the Iranian Revolution. But then it wasn't until the 1990s that it really came to the fore as like a coherent ideological concept and vision for Iran. And that was with the election of Mohammad Khatami in 1997, where it was a landslide victory for him that really shocked the Iranian political landscape. But the reformists within Iran have had a very blemished record. When they were in power under Khatami, and then with Rouhani, he wasn't a reformist, but he was a centrist and allied with the reformists. They've really been really obstructed by a lot of these kind of unelected institutions, whether that be the Supreme Leader, the Revolutionary Guards, the Guardian Council. So they haven't really been able to bring about the kind of reform that many Iranians who had supported them have sought. But with that said, like I said, it's a spectrum. So now we have within the reformists people who can be considered more radical reformists who did not participate in this election, for example. And there's a number of, prominent political prisoners, or even Mir Hossein Mousavi, the former presidential candidate in 2009, if you remember, that the Green Movement protests against Ahmadinejad. So he actually is under house arrest. He was silent about this election, but then other reformists and prominent people from the reformist camp and the current reformist establishment went all out for Pezeshkian. And this included Mehdi Karoubi, who was also 2009 Green Movement leader. But in terms of what the reformists have pushed toward domestically, both under Khatami and what Pezeshkian is promising to do is to open up the political space to kind of allow for more freedom of press, opposing a lot of the imprisoning of people for their political beliefs, lessening these restrictions on social behavior, mandatory hijab, and pursuing a policy of de-escalation and calling out the hardliners for various provocative acts. For example, Pezeshkian in this campaign really censured his hardline rivals over the attacks on the Saudi and British embassies in Iran over the past 10 years. But all of this is to be caveated by the fact that they are very constrained, So Pezeshkian promises this stuff, or Khatami was even more radical, actually, than Pezeshkian took a much more moderate approach in terms of not necessarily being confrontational towards like these various entrenched power centers in Iran. So that's going to affect his, the turnout was low, but still, you had 50% of people turn out. Most people voted for Pezeshkian. And so these are the people who are really hanging their last hopes on some kind of incremental change happening, and the Islamic Republic at its highest levels of decision making deciding to have some tangible reforms. But whether Pezeshkian is going to be successful in doing that, obviously remains to be seen.
Yeah, I mean, to the extent there are any of the reforms that you just cited, they're likely just to be relatively incremental, right?
Absolutely. So we shouldn't expect transformational change, that this is someone who is within the confines of this system. He's operating. He is fundamentally loyal to this system. Like he's supporting this kind of mode of governance of the Islamic Republic, this kind of velayat faqih, this rule of clerical leaders. But yeah, so within this context, he is someone who is trying to push things in the direction of more control by elected institutions, kind of less restrictions on women, more internet freedom, for example, is another thing he really pushed, because Iran has a very pervasive system of kind of internet filtering and blocking foreign websites. So these are the kind of changes that could be expected, but especially on foreign policy, he's been also much more direct about seeking negotiations, seeking diplomatic settlements, and highlighting the debilitating impact of sanctions. So even that, he doesn't have that much leeway, but he's not powerless either.
So that's interesting. So on foreign policy, the ultimate decision making is with the religious regime. Like, how much leeway, though, does he have if he's seeking, like better relations? I mean, relations are pretty much as bad as they could get right now, it would seem, between Iran and the West. But does he have any like room to maneuver if he wants to open up a bit and reduce tensions? And like, what might that look like?
Yeah, so when it comes to the fundamental orientation of Iran's foreign policy, Iran being this revisionist power in the Middle East that is against Israel and is supporting, the so-called axis of resistance against Israel and U.S. influence in the region, that is against the U.S. or has had this hostile relationship with the United States and is kind of pivoting towards Russia and China and this kind of emerging multipolar global order. That I don't see that changing in a major way. But what Pezeshkian, within the context of the Iranian system, on foreign policy, the president is the head of the Supreme National Security Council, which is this body that is comprised of figures from the military and the spectrum of various political officials in Iran. And they kind of, by consensus, make decisions about major national security issues. And the Supreme Leader pretty much always goes with that consensus decision, although he does have veto power over it. And there have been a number of times that he has kind of overruled what the National Security Council has preferred. So Pezeshkian, within this context, by emphasizing the need to remove sanctions and emphasizing the need for better, like he's really talked about the need for balanced foreign relations with the world. So he highlighted in the presidential debates that Iran can't just rely on Russia and China, and this has not been advantageous for it. It hasn't really gotten much from those countries, and it's been suffering a lot because of its kind of reflexively anti-American approach. And that if it can have better relations with Europe and the West and America, that this will allow for more kind of competitive foreign relations and more balanced foreign relations. Now, again, I think, the Revolutionary Guards, Khamenei, they do not want a normalization of U.S.-Iran relations for a variety of reasons, including their longstanding policies and the legacy of their approach and what their vision for the region. But I think getting to de-escalation and getting to some sort of agreement similar to the nuclear deal of 2015, rein in Iran's nuclear program and perhaps have some elements in the region that both sides could benefit from this. And then, depending on what impact that has on Iran, if that can deliver, economic benefits for Iran, if that delivers on what the US and its allies want in the region and on Iran's nuclear program, then that could be a stepping stone towards perhaps changes more deeply in the relationship between Iran and the US. But in this near term, I think what Pezeshkian makes more viable is de-escalation with the West, making that a priority within Iran's internal debates. He will carry the political cost of any negotiations with Biden or Trump, which Khamenei, if anything, it benefits him to use a kind of more moderate reformist figure as a scapegoat. And so it's pretty nuanced.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. So he's like the first high-level president, since Rouhani, since 2021, that's not like ideologically opposed to opening better relations with the West, which I suppose is significant.
There are consequential differences within the spectrum of the Islamic Republic, both on foreign policy issues and economic issues, but again, not in this fundamental reorientation of Iran's policies. So, for example, Rouhani really invested all of his political capital on negotiating with the West, trying to get the nuclear deal. And then after he got the nuclear deal, before Trump came, he said he wants to do a JCPOA 2, 3, and 4 domestically, meaning he wants to take these big initiatives to kind of reform certain things domestically. And he was very much of a liberal economically, supporting privatization, increased foreign investment. But then, Khamenei and them, like, for example, after Rouhani gave that speech where he talked about a JCPOA 2, 3, and 4 domestically, Khamenei gave a speech very sharply rebuking that. And, Khamenei's perennial fear has also been with the reformists that they would be kind of Gorbachev-like figures that would bring about kind of regime change from within. This has been one reason why the reformists have been so clamped down upon and constrained. But at the same time, in the face of this legitimacy crisis, I think Khamenei is letting them have another go at it. Pezeshkian is a more kind of not as confrontational of a figure. But I think overall, change in Iran is inevitable given what I would argue is the unsustainability of the current governance model. So Pezeshkian, I think, will be very interesting to see if he can actually affect more tangible reforms and perhaps easing of tensions with the West that down the road could actually bring around even bigger change in Iran.
So it seems like one potential near-term crisis that could upend what you just mentioned would be like an all-out war in southern Lebanon between the Israeli Defense Forces and Hezbollah. Things are very volatile there at the moment, almost like near daily exchange of fire. How much influence does Pezeshkian have in determining how or what might be Iran's response to whatever happens in that southern Lebanon context, be it either some sort of diplomatic solution, which is being sort of negotiated right now, or on the other hand, if this devolves into like all-out war between Hezbollah and Israel?
Yes, this is one area that in the very near term, like you said, requires some level of US-Iran cooperation, tacit cooperation. Like we've seen back channel talks, since October 7th between the US and Iran, where both sides do not want a regional war. Both sides have been trying to varying degrees of effectiveness and also to varying degrees of them actually wanting to do this, restraining their kind of local allies in the region, like the Iranian backed militias in Iraq, ceased their attacks for a time. So Pezeshkian, within this context, I think this is a very important early opportunity for the Biden administration to, if not publicly, to try to creates some kind of positive diplomatic momentum. And I think definitely Pezeshkian, it comes from the camp within Tehran that does not want a regional escalation, that wants to contain this conflict, end this conflict as soon as possible. And that's not the uniform position in Iran. Like, for example, Saeed Jalili, who was his hardline rival in the second round of the election, he's someone who I think has a much more higher threshold for war, regional war, that some people within that camp in Tehran openly argue that regional war could even be advantageous for Iran. It'll have a short-term cost, but ultimately it could actually expand Iran's position in the region, or if there's some kind of negotiated settlement, it'll backfire for Israel and the United States. So within this context, that Pezeshkian, I think, is a much more effective partner for the United States, someone who they can more easily talk to. He's going to be bringing back a lot of the team of Rouhani. Some of those people like Javad Zarif is looking like he might at least have some kind of advisory role with his administration.
Yeah, was Iran's former foreign minister. I'm actually staring out at his graduate school right now out here in Denver.
Yes,
headquarters of the podcast is a couple blocks away from where he went to grad school.
Yeah, I got his PhD there. And so, he's someone who's for years and years Iran's ambassador to the United Nations, very fluent in English, and negotiated the nuclear deal with Obama. So this is the kind, it's going to be a more pragmatic, more West-leaning kind of faction that is going to be in charge of the presidency in Iran right now.
Lastly, in the coming months or weeks even, what are kind of the next steps, the next moments you'll be looking towards that will indicate to you either how Pezeshkian might govern or what kind of the mood in Iran is politically?
Yeah, so the key things to watch out for is on July 28th is his inauguration, when he'll formally become president. He has about 2 weeks after that to introduce his cabinet appointees to parliament. That'll be a very significant indicator of what direction he wants to take the country in. For example, if he's promised to appoint women in cabinet ministry posts, which was only done once before for one ministry, and that was actually under the conservative president, Ahmadinejad, who had a female minister, but also appointing ethnic minorities, Sunnis, Kurds, Baluchis. He said he wants to give them senior posts in the government. And then on foreign policy, I think the key things in the immediate future to watch out for, like the low-hanging fruit, is Iran's cooperation with the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, that has been charged with inspecting Iran's nuclear facilities. It's gotten massively reduced access ever since America left the nuclear deal, and then Iran responded by also kind of lowering its compliance with the deal. So the IAEA actually just censured Iran about a month ago for its non-compliance. So there's a big dispute between them right now. So, for example, Pezeshkian, one goodwill overture he could potentially do is to kind of enhance cooperation with the IAEA, bring a little bit more transparency into their nuclear activities. But I think the ball is also in Biden's court. Even though he's got an election coming up, obviously he can't do any major diplomatic efforts with Iran. But at this kind of low level, putting a lid on escalation, preventing the regional situation from getting worse, getting a ceasefire, preventing the conflict in Gaza, and giving Iran some carrots in exchange for it doing cooperation with the IAEA or reining back other nuclear expansion it's been doing. I think these are the key things to watch out for in the next 2 months.
Well, Sina, thank you so much. This was really helpful.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Global Dispatches. The show is produced by me, Mark Leon Goldberg. It is edited and mixed by Levi Sharp. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts, make sure to follow the show and enable automatic downloads to get new episodes as soon as they're released. On Spotify, tap the bell icon to get a notification when we publish new episodes. And of course, please visit globaldispatches.org to get on our free mailing list, get in touch with me, and access our full archive. Thank you.